G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of starting our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. What an episode we have for you today, because we're taking a deep dive into the life of the greatest, Muhammad Ali, the man who legendary interviewer Michael Parkinson once introduced as the most famous man in the world, and it's hard to think of a contender. Muhammad Ali fused politics and sport like no other athlete ever before him, and I must admit, I'm a big fan of heavyweight boxing, not because of the violence of it, but because it's a sport that seems to only deal with life's biggest themes. You hear the old school boxing aficionados referring to someone going to meet their maker or staring death in the face, and sometimes that means literally. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me that many heavyweight boxers are deeply philosophical thinkers and often very religious. Plus, in order to be able to stay present in the ring, it seems to me that you really do need to have a real connection with your purpose and the meaning you derive from doing that. Otherwise, no one would get into the ring. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn from looking at heavyweight boxers, and particularly Ali, who is the best, both as a fighter and as a philosopher. In today's episode, I want to contextualize some of the main events in Ali's life so that we can draw on their importance in future episodes. Like with the other biographical episodes, such as the ones on Edith Cowan or Leonardo da Vinci, we're going to try and demystify some of the mythology of Ali by examining his story. By looking at how Ali faced challenges and solved problems, it can give us real insight into his character, and we have a better chance of emulating his behaviours if we can understand his attitudes and why he adopted them. To me, Ali is the classic example of someone who pursued individuation, and although he arguably possessed one of the most famous personas of all time, there was so much more to his personality than just what appeared at face value. There was also something that struck me while doing some research on Ali. In my opinion, he's the preeminent example of someone who embodied the principles of self-determination, obviously in a political sense, but also in a psychological sense. He was able to overcome his internal demons, to the point where it seemed from the outside that his main enemies were external. And indirectly, that's part of what this podcast is about. Because if we can find the recipe for psychological self-determinism, if we can find a way of liberating people from our inner demons, then we can leverage our full resourcefulness to combat the external issues that face all of us. It seems to me that so much external conflict comes from, on some level, actually fighting ourselves. And Ali was able to transcend that and focus his negative energy outward. He really was someone who was able to get the best out of himself in the service of others. So that's what I want to start to unpack a bit of today. Because to me, even though for much of his life his body was failing him, Muhammad Ali is one of the people who truly got the most out of a human lifetime. And at the end of the podcast today, I'm going to tell you why that's backed up by thousands of years of Greek mythology. But before I do, I want to tell you about the life of the single most influential athlete who ever lived, an icon of self-determinism, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Marcellus Clay VI on the 17th of January 1942. He was born less than 2 months after America had officially joined World War II, and he was raised in the atmosphere of a segregated America in Louisville, Kentucky. Although he didn't start boxing until around adolescence, he spent his childhood honing his agility and movement in the backyard of his family home, asking his brother to throw rocks at him so he could try and dodge them. According to his brother, he never once connected with Ali, who was too nimble and agile to be hit, and he never even once managed to get his brother. Although, even at such a young age, he apparently had talent and athleticism, young Ali had no outlet to use his skills in any sporting sense. That was until one fateful day in October 1954. Ali and a friend had gone to the Columbia Auditorium to attend the Louisville Home Show. After the boys enjoyed themselves looking at the products for sale and taking advantage of the free food, they returned to their bicycles ready to go home. To their absolute horror, Ali's red and white Schwinn bike had been stolen, and this upset him greatly, so he tearfully went off to find a police officer. In a striking bit of serendipity that would arguably change the course of history, certainly in a sporting sense, the police officer on duty that day at the auditorium was a man named Joe Martin, a police officer who also happened to coach young boys at a local gym in boxing. Fighting back tears, Ali said to the officer, "I'm going to whoop whoever stole my bike." Joe Martin's reply was something that lit a fire in the young Ali and started him on a journey that was to last the rest of his life. Well, if you're going to learn to whoop someone, then you better learn to fight. At that point, one day at the Louisville Home Show, the career of the greatest boxer of all time began. From the moment he tried it, Ali loved boxing. He took to it like a duck to water, and by the age of 18 had won 6 Kentucky Gold Gloves awards and 2 national AAU titles. Even at this time, around the age of 14 or 15, Ali would talk himself up. All he talked about was boxing and becoming world champion, even at the age of 14. So although, as we discovered last week, Gorgeous George had a huge influence on Ali's later persona, it wasn't as if it wasn't authentic to who Ali was in the first place. He was always the Louisville Lip. After 108 amateur boxing bouts, in which he was coached by Joe Martin, Ali qualified for the 1960 Olympics in Rome. It was to be the event at which he announced himself on the world stage. Just 6 years after having his bike stolen and picking up a set of gloves for the first time in his life, Ali was Olympic champion. In terms of Ali's life as a boxer, this was pretty much the point of no return. It's kind of hilarious how often the Olympic gold medal is an afterthought in Ali's career, when so many people would give so much for one. But as we'll find out towards the end of today's episode, I think it provides one of the most poignant symbols for the life of Ali. Ali himself actually threw the gold medal away, not long after the Olympics, tossing it into the Ohio River, never to be seen again. Although his medal had brought him national notoriety and he had garnered a huge amount of international popularity, Ali was refused service one day at a restaurant designated for white people in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. To Ali, the medal was worthless if it didn't afford him the basic rights and decency at home, and so he discarded it, thinking it to be a symbol of the oppression and racism in America, rather than representative of his victory. Although upset by the racist treatment he'd received, Ali was undeterred and continued on towards his goal of becoming the heavyweight champion of the world, and so he signed his first professional contract. Ali made his debut on October 29, 1960, at the tender age of 18, going undefeated in his first 19 fights, 15 of those coming by knockout. Interestingly enough, one of those he defeated was his former trainer, Archie Moore. To borrow some of the terminology from recent episodes, Ali was still a teenager and he'd already surpassed his teacher in a technical boxing sense. He was an incredible natural talent. Upon signing his first contract, Ali chose to pay off the mortgage on his family home and buy his mum a pink Cadillac. For the ambitious dreamer from Kentucky, he'd finally made it as a boxer. Undefeated as a professional, Olympic champion as an amateur, it seemed that Ali's trajectory was destined for greatness. That trajectory became assured by a chance meeting at a Las Vegas radio station in 1961 with a certain wrestler named Gorgeous George. Those of you who heard last week's podcast will be familiar with Gorgeous George, the professional wrestler who created the heel or villain character in sports. That day at the radio station, Ali was there to promote his fight against huge Hawaiian heavyweight Duke Sabadong. Although he had already earned the name the Louisville Lip, or Gaseous Cassius, often correctly picking the exact round he would beat his opponents, Ali had been strangely subdued before the fight with Sabadong. In a relatively timid exhibition compared to the showman we came to know him as, Ali declared, "Somebody's got to go before the 10th, and you can bet it won't be me." The host then turned to Gorgeous George, who made Ali look relatively apprehensive when he said, "I am the greatest. I cannot be defeated. All my so-called opponents are afraid of me, and they're right to be afraid because I am the king. I'm warning everybody right now, if this bum I'm fighting messes up the pretty waves in my hair, I'm going to kill him. I'll tear off his arm. Not only am I the best wrestler, the most highly skilled with the greatest technique, but also the most beautiful wrestler who ever lived. That's why all these curs, these ignorant brutes, don't want to take me on. They're afraid of my brilliant style of wrestling, and they know the fans will only want to gaze at my manly beauty. As we spoke about last week, this was to be the start of the Ali that we know today, and his encounter with Gorgeous George spurred him on to becoming the braggadocious and brilliant bard that we know him as today. What we didn't cover last week, though, was some of the context in which Muhammad Ali made that decision. Because in my opinion, the danger he faced in making it is underrated, and it's actually one of the most courageous things he ever did. As I said before, Ali grew up during racial segregation in America. Sport, and particularly boxing, broke the barriers for black people relatively early. Jack Johnson became the first African American world champion in heavyweight boxing in 1908, and according to legendary filmmaker Ken Burns, for more than 13 years, Jack Johnson was the most famous and most notorious African American on earth. Such was Johnson's success that his existence offended some of the racist white people of the era, who started a search for the quote-unquote Great White Hope. Their search brought them to Jim Jeffries, a white boxer known for his incredible strength and stamina. In 1910, Johnson and Jeffries fought what was then considered the fight of the century. Before the fight, the challenger Jeffries stayed relatively hidden, with Johnson largely promoting the fight by himself, using his vibrant personality to drum up interest in the affair. When the fight was won, Johnson ultimately came out on top. The victory caused race riots across America, and people were killed. The rioting white people felt humiliated after Jeffries' defeat, and were now resigned to the fact that they would never find their great white hope. Black people across America, on the other hand, were jubilant, feeling that Johnson's victory was a significant step for racial advancement. Johnson's success and flamboyant personality drew the ire of the racist establishment in America, and Johnson was arrested for violating the Mann Act, a law that forbade men to take women across state lines for quote-unquote immoral purposes. The woman who they charged Johnson with violating the Mann Act? His wife, who was a white woman who helped him run a successful nightclub and restaurant. She was accused of being a prostitute. She refused to cooperate with the case, however, and it fell apart. A few months later, another white woman came forward, and they were successfully able to convict Johnson on the Mann Act. By all accounts, these were fairly dubious circumstances, though. For Muhammad Ali, he wasn't just putting his neck out there to face ridicule. There was a precedent set for charges being run up against a flamboyant black champion if they didn't go along with the way the white establishment wanted them to behave. The other African American boxer I'll take the opportunity to note here is Joe Louis. Louis received worldwide popularity through his fights with Max Schmeling of Germany. After initially being defeated by Schmeling in their first fight in 1937, Louis went on to become world champion later that year. He refused to accept the title, however, until he defeated Schmeling, and he got his opportunity the next year. Although he'd eventually helped save Jewish people by assisting with their escape from Germany during World War II, in the 1930s, Schmeling came to be seen as a symbol for Hitler's racial philosophy. This galvanised support for Louis, who became incredibly popular when he defeated Schmeling to become the undisputed world champion. This popularity only grew when Louis enlisted in World War II and went off to fight in Europe. After his safe return, now a decorated veteran, Louis continued his career and picked up where he left off as a world champion, holding the title for 12 years and setting the record for the most successful world title defences. So that's the landscape that Muhammad Ali walked into when he decided that he was going to become the most flamboyant, outspoken boxer in the world. Previously, flamboyant black boxers were arrested on dubious charges and harassed out of the sport. And he was following on from Joe Louis, who was a hero to the world for defeating a symbol of the Nazis and a hero to those in his own country for fighting in World War II. This is something that's particularly significant a little bit later in Ali's story, but it's worth noting here the tangible obstacles and threats that Ali faced when he decided to become the fast-talking bragger that the world came to love. Interestingly too, some commentators have said that Ali combined the flamboyance of Johnson with the character of Louis, so it's clear that these two at least had some influence on Ali. Ali would use his newfound bravado that he got from Gorgeous George to enable him to have his first shot at the world title. Ali would taunt the current world champion Sonny Liston from afar, hoping to create enough public interest in the matchup that Liston would allow him his shot. He taunted Liston, provoking him in the media, calling him ugly, and saying the world needed a pretty champion like himself. Muhammad Ali around this time was an absolute artist when it came to manipulating the media. He once convinced a magazine to give him a 5-page photographic spread to show off his revolutionary underwater training regime. The entire thing turned out to be a hoax though, with Ali not even being able to swim properly. This, of course, only came to light after the 5-page spread, complete with large-scale photographs, was published. Ali's plan to provoke Liston worked. Ali had in fact enraged Liston so much that one day he pulled out a gun, firing towards Ali, terrifying all the media who were there. Ali fled, with Liston showing everyone, including the cameras, that the gun only carried blanks. The whole thing was a bizarre affair looking at it through a 21st century lens. Ali knew that he'd got his man though, and he knew that Liston's stunt would make front page news. He had provoked Liston enough to get such a reaction that it was only a matter of time before the two would fight. At the weigh-in before the fight, Ali created a huge stir by rushing into the room with his entourage, yelling and shouting with a flurry of energy. "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Rumble, young man, rumble," he would yell at the crowd of media, his adoring entourage goading him to go on. These were not scenes that had been seen before in boxing, with weigh-ins traditionally a much quieter and more subdued affair. Ali recognised that he could drum up further interest in the fight if he carried on with bluster and bravado, so he told his entourage to hold him back as if he literally couldn't wait to have his shot at the champ. Before the fight, Ali was paying $7 in today's decimal betting. No one really gave him a chance. On the night of the fight, Ali was scared to death. The way that he talked up each fight raised the stakes incredibly for himself. It was as if he was betting his entire reputation on the outcome of each fight. Ali's legendary trainer Angelo Dundee was more optimistic though. He knew that Liston's weaknesses and the areas that he'd struggled before were Ali's strengths, and so he instilled his young fighter with the belief that he could win. As the fight got underway, Ali was holding his own. He was performing surprisingly well against the champ, and seemed well on top in the fight until the end of the 4th round when he felt a burning sensation in his eyes. As legend has it, Liston either rubbed lotion on his gloves or on his shoulder, which Ali had damaged in the fight. This got into Ali's eyes and he became unable to see. Despite his blindness, against the heavyweight champion of the world, an absolute brute of a man who had the power to kill people, unable to see, Ali went back into the ring. In the following rounds, he copped a barrage from Liston, who sensed the opportunity. He was only able to put out his hand and feel where Liston was, and unable to mount any real attack. By the 6th round, Ali's sight had returned though, and he was able to fight properly again. It was to be the final round of the fight, with Liston's corner throwing in the towel at the break. Ali had become world champion at just 22 years of age, 10 years after he first pulled on a set of boxing gloves. I'll put up a whole bunch of videos at the episode page for today, which you can access at www.individuate.com.au. So everything that I mentioned in today's podcast, you'll be able to access easily. But of all of them, the video of Ali post-fight with Liston is probably my favourite. He has a look of unbridled excitement that is absolutely infectious to watch, and he delivered one of his most famous post-fight interviews. "I don't have a mark on my face, and I upset Sonny Liston, and I just turned 22 years old. I must be the greatest. I shook up the world." He had now fully arrived on the world stage as a boxer, the world champion at just 22 years of age, possessing an outrageous amount of talent that probably would have given him great notoriety on its own. But it's at this point, literally on top of the world in a boxing sense, Ali joined the Nation of Islam. According to Ali, he first heard about the Nation of Islam in 1959, but it wasn't until 1961 that he first attended a meeting. He continued to attend meetings at the Nation of Islam, although his admission was initially rejected due to his boxing career. After defeating Liston, the group's leader, Elijah Muhammad, agreed to admit Ali. His involvement with the Nation of Islam also led to a friendship with Malcolm X, famed civil rights leader in America. Interestingly as well, before changing his name to Muhammad Ali, he chose the name Cassius X, presumably due to his friendship with Malcolm X. He had chosen to give up the name Cassius Clay due to its connection with slavery. Ali's great-great-grandfather had been a slave, and the name Clay came from a white slave owner. Although he emancipated slaves in his lifetime, records indicate that he had more slaves when slavery was finally abolished than he had initially inherited from his father. He had chosen the name Muhammad, meaning one who is worthy of praise, and Ali, which means most high. This was announced by the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, in a radio broadcast in 1964. At the time, nearly everyone in Ali's entourage was against his name change and public display of his religious affiliation. Not because they disagreed with Ali's right to do it, but because they knew it wouldn't be received well by the general public, and they wanted Ali to be a popular champion. Ali, however, wasn't afraid to antagonise the white establishment, declaring, "I am America. I'm the part that you won't recognise, but get used to me. Black, confident, cocky. My name, not yours. My religion, not yours. My goals, my own. Get used to me." Despite the protests, Ali stayed true to his convictions and continued his involvement with the Nation of Islam, even after his former friend Malcolm X was kicked out of the group and later assassinated. Ali and Malcolm X had fallen out when X had left the Nation of Islam, and Ali later said that turning his back on X was one of the mistakes that he regretted most in his life. I do want to note here that Ali's name change and religious affiliation wasn't just symbolically provocative. The doctrine of the Nation of Islam labelled white people as the perpetrators of genocide against African American people, and some people viewed the group as a quote-unquote hate religion with a propensity towards violence. I must admit that Ali said a number of things throughout his life that I disagree with. Interviewer Michael Parkinson went as far as to say that some of the things that Ali said were racist. But for me, Ali is less of a hateful or racist figure than one of self-determination. I think he potentially had an understanding of how powerful being an agitator could be, but I don't consider him hateful. Ali said at the time, "We who followed the teachings of Elijah Muhammad don't want to be forced to integrate. Integration is wrong. We don't want to live with the white man. That's all." This is not a sentiment that was shared by the general public, many of whom openly hated Ali. Such was his divisiveness when Sonny Liston was granted a rematch with Ali and was floored by his famous phantom punch. Many people came out and said that the fight was staged. A panel even appeared on evening television discussing whether the punch could have plausibly knocked someone out. The punch seemed to come from nowhere, and it was one of Ali's trademark anchor punches, which comes from low with his elbows moving late, so his opponents didn't have a chance to read the wind-up like a traditional power punch. Ali later said that the punch was completed in just 4/100ths of a second, faster than the human blink, so the only reason anyone could have missed the punch was if they blinked at the wrong time. Slow motion footage later backed up Ali's claim that the knockout was legitimate. After again defeating Liston and retaining his world championship, Ali's next fight of note took place against former world champion Floyd Patterson. The build-up to the fight was intense, with Patterson a staunch critic of Ali's politics. Patterson insisted on referring to Ali as Clay, coming out before the fight and saying, "My only interest in fighting him isn't for the money. It's merely to take the championship away and put it back to where it belongs, for all of America, not just a black Muslim." The fight was to be the first of many of Ali's that was billed as good versus evil. Supporters of Patterson saw Ali as an ungrateful radical and weren't afraid to let their hate be known. The fight itself was a complete mismatch, with Ali toying with Patterson for most of the fight, not even throwing a punch in round one, using his incredible movement and defensive agility to humiliate Patterson. When he finally did start attacking, it was brutal. Ali was all over Patterson, but backed off at critical moments to prolong the fight. It lasted 12 grueling rounds, with the referee eventually ending the punishment and awarding the fight to Ali. A New York Times reporter later said, "The fight was like watching someone pull the wings off a butterfly." Ali's victory celebrations weren't to last long, however, as on the 14th of February 1966, the draft rules changed, and Ali was no longer exempt from military service in Vietnam. He'd initially been discounted due to his aptitude testing, which allegedly gave him an IQ of 78. Ali was largely illiterate, and it's believed he was dyslexic. This is something Ali himself addressed in an interview with Michael Parkinson, where he talks about being intelligent in other ways. Interestingly, Ali ended up giving addresses to graduating students at Harvard, and is one of the most prominent poets of the 20th century. So I think he was correct to challenge the idea that he wasn't intelligent. Ali heard the news about the change in draft rules from the news media, who continually called him at his home. History remembers Ali delivering a much more blunt assessment than there is any evidence of him actually saying. He's reported to have said, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word." But there's no evidence of Ali ever saying the second part of that quote. According to Robert Lipset, the journalist who met with Ali to write a feature on his response, Ali's immediate reaction was more selfish than openly political. He apparently said to Lipset, "Why me? I can't understand it. How did they do this to me? The heavyweight champion of the world." This garnered interest from other reporters, who probed him with further questions. Ali replied to them, "How can they do this without another test to see whether I'm wiser or worse than the last time? I'm fighting for the government every day. I think it cost them $12 million a day to stay in Vietnam, and I buy lots of bullets, at least 3 jet bombers a year, and pay the salary of 50,000 fighting men with the money they take from me after my fights." In the context of 1960s America, this was enough to cause a huge stir, and a queue of people lined up to begin the chorus of condemnation against Ali. In the context of former champion Joe Louis, who had gone to fight in World War II, many people felt that Ali was being unpatriotic. When he later did say, "I ain't got no quarrel with no Viet Cong," people felt justified that he was against America. Broadcasters and boxing commissions began to put great pressure on Ali, and he was forced to go overseas to continue his boxing. He went to Canada and then England and Germany, where he gathered a huge supporter base. People felt that he was truly bringing world championship boxing to the world. For most of the past 50 years, it had mainly been in America, and so in a global sense, although it was forced, Ali had become the people's champion. He later returned to the US to fight with Ernie Terrell, a man who refused to call Ali by his chosen name. The weigh-in before the fight is an intense affair, and I think one of the greatest illustrations that Ali wasn't just a boxer. His disgust at Terrell is evident, and he vowed to beat up on Terrell and make him announce his name right there in the center of the ring after the fight. During the fight itself, Ali destroyed Terrell, choosing to prolong the fight by substituting his punches with shouts of "What's my name?" to ensure Terrell wasn't knocked out. I think this fight was a landmark moment for Ali. Terrell was symbolic of a huge number of people who refused to call him by his chosen name, and Ali's brutal beatdown of Terrell seemed to reflect that representation. Like with Floyd Patterson, who also refused to use his name, he toyed with Terrell, backing off at crucial moments to ensure that he wasn't knocked out. There was public outrage against Ali, who many had thought was cruel to prolong the punishment against Terrell. After the fight, Terrell admitted that he'd made a mistake not calling Ali by his chosen name, and forevermore referred to him as Muhammad Ali. Just 2 months after the fight with Terrell, on the 28th of April 1967, Ali was summoned to the Houston Induction Center to be drafted into the United States military. When it came time for him to take one step forward, indicating his acceptance of the assigned role, he refused. In doing so, Ali faced a 5-year jail term and a $10,000 fine. Ali recognised this, but he stayed true to his beliefs, stating, "I've been in jail for 400 years. I could be there for 4 or 5 more, but I ain't going no 10,000 miles to help murder and kill poor people." It was a stance that was personally praised by civil rights leader Martin Luther King. Other than the fact that he faced personal prosecution, it was explained to him that he would likely have a non-combat role and could see out the war making personal appearances and fighting exhibitions for the morale of the troops. He instead declined anyway, saying that he couldn't serve in any capacity that would give aid to a war that he felt to be morally wrong. After Ali had made his position public, absolute chaos ensued. The army came out confirming that Ali had refused induction into the draft, and they'd notified the Attorney General. Within the hour, he was stripped of his boxing titles, and in a move that was seen by some to be vindictive, he was stripped of his passport by the US government, so he couldn't go overseas to make money. This left him with no income for his wife and newborn child. It was to be 3 years before Ali fought again, the years from when he was 25 to 28, arguably the prime years for a fighter. When he came back, Ali wasn't the fighter he was before his ban, and many boxing enthusiasts believe that even though he's the best of all time, we lost the best years of Ali as a boxer. Throughout his ban, Ali toured around America's colleges speaking out against the war. His popularity on campuses growing as the anti-war sentiment towards the war with Vietnam grew. Eventually, after a long and arduous battle, the charges against him were dropped by the Supreme Court, who ruled unanimously 8-0 in his favour. For his comeback fight, he chose to fight heavyweight contender Jerry Quarry. Quarry was top 5 in the world. Ali could have fought anyone, but he chose a real contender. That was because he wanted to get back to be the world champion, a position held at that time by his soon-to-be nemesis, Smoking Joe Frazier. He didn't get his wish immediately though, initially fighting Oscar Bonavena, who dished out to Ali the first real damage of his career, but Ali was able to prevail. Finally, he had earned his shot at regaining the world title. A matchup that was the most anticipated fight of all time, billed as the fight of the century, and it delivered. It was the first time in history that two undefeated champions had fought each other, and each had legitimate claims to the belt at the time. Frazier refused to refer to Ali by his chosen name, and Ali didn't hold back with the trash talk of Frazier either. The two men absolutely hated each other. For Ali, he saw himself as a proud fighter of oppression, and Joe Frazier was his antithesis. For Frazier, he absolutely hated Ali for casting him as the villain. He was much more softly spoken than Ali, and didn't possess the same amount of charm or wit. So much was Frazier's hate for his opponent. Before the fight, he prayed to God to help him kill Ali. The fight itself was a ruthless spectacle. They were trading blows, with Ali punching Frazier 5 times or so before Frazier would belt him with a much heavier blow. After the fight, Frazier spent a month in hospital. This is despite being the eventual winner of the fight on points, knocking Ali down in the 15th round. Defense wasn't a priority for either boxer, trading brutal blows, often just trying to knock the other man down first, unconcerned for their own safety. Frazier lost 10 pounds during the fight, and due to the constant barrage on his hips and body, Ali couldn't walk without pain for a week afterwards. The aftermath of the fight involved much more than just physical pain for Ali. He felt he'd lost everything. He still called himself the greatest, but he knew that he'd have to fight his way back to the top if he wanted to get another shot at the world title. He fought every few months, slowly regaining the speed and endurance he'd lost during his enforced layoff. He could no longer rely just on his speed, and many of his training sessions were spent up on the ropes, getting absolutely belted by his heavy-hitting sparring partners, training his body to take punishment. Arnold Schwarzenegger also said that Ali told him of his training regime that he only started counting the push-ups when he started to feel the burn. Ali was an astonishingly fierce trainer. This translated into success in the ring. Ali lined up a set of challenges with a diverse range of styles and dismantled them all. That was until he came up against Ken Norton. Norton was a super heavy hitter and possessed a style which challenged Ali. In the fight, Ali had his jaw broken in the 2nd round, but fought on until the 12th, 10 of those rounds spent in immense pain. After recovering his jaw, which had to be wide shut, Ali beat Norton in the rematch, just 7 months after Norton initially shattered his jaw. As Ali was making his way back up to the top, Joe Frazier had lost the world championship to an up-and-coming hard hitter by the name of George Foreman. This meant that in order for Ali or Frazier to get a chance at a title fight, they would have to defeat each other. The rematch of the fight of the century was a relatively more subdued affair. It wasn't a world championship fight, but with the winner getting the chance to take on Foreman, it definitely wasn't a manufactured matchup like boxing has become in much of the last 20 years. The fight took place on January 28, 1974, at Madison Square Garden, 3 years since the initial encounter. Like the first fight, it was a brutal war of attrition, with neither man really concerned for defense or seemingly his own safety. Ali won the fight on points, but Frazier didn't accept the loss. He admonished the referee for breaking them up too early and not letting him work at Ali's body from the inside when the two fighters were wrestling close together. This was something that Frazier employed a lot, so he felt that he was at a significant disadvantage not being able to use that technique. The fight went to Ali though, although it set up an enticing third affair with the two champions locked at 1-1. In the meantime, however, Ali had a small matter to take care of, as he was now eligible to fight George Foreman for the World Championship. The fight was eventually organised by infamous promoter Don King, who had secured $10 million to take the fight to Zaire in the Belgian Congo. The World Heavyweight Championship was going to Africa for a fight now known as the Rumble in the Jungle. We'll just pause here to say, for anyone who hasn't seen it, the Oscar-winning documentary When We Were Kings is probably my favourite documentary of all time, and I'd seriously recommend it, even if you don't like boxing, because the Rumble in the Jungle wasn't just a boxing bout, it was a cultural event. At the accompanying concert, B.B. King and James Brown performed, and for the people in Africa, they felt that they were finally taking their seat at the world table. Ali was an immensely popular figure in Africa. Foreman couldn't work out why there was such a disparity in popularity and questioned the hostility towards him. But to the people of Africa, Foreman represented the oppressive side of America. He'd brought his German Shepherd with him, and he was hated for it, as this was the dog used by the Belgians as police dogs in their brutal treatment of the Congolese. The sentiment was captured by Malian actor Malik Bowens, who said, "Yes, Muhammad Ali, he was lighter, but he was a real person. He was genuine. Ali could have had even lighter skin than he was, but for us, he was fighting the good cause, for Africans and the whole world." Ali's popularity was symbolised by the continual chants of Ali Boumaye, meaning Ali kill him, which followed him everywhere he went around Africa. The same couldn't be said of Foreman though, who didn't possess the same ability to stir up his fervent set of supporters. In an interview before the fight, Foreman said, "There were some kids following me, saying George Foreman Boumaye, but I don't think that's so nice meaning. If they have anything to say about me, they can say George Foreman loves Africa, or George Foreman likes being here, not George Foreman kill him. I don't like that." I think it's fair to say that Foreman hadn't spent much time around Gorgeous George. But despite his lack of wit, Foreman was a frightening opponent. He had easily beaten Ken Norton and Joe Frazier, who had both beaten up on Ali, and his style was one that traditionally gave Ali difficulty. Such was Foreman's strength that when hitting the heavy bag, he'd actually lift his trainer off the ground with the force of each punch, and after his session striking the bag, he'd leave a dent the size of a watermelon. According to writer Norman Mailer, Ali never once looked across to Foreman, hitting the heavy bag. It'd almost be like a tightrope walker looking down and trying to analyse how far the drop is, and Ali didn't let himself think about it. Undeterred by Foreman's size and strength, Ali rattled off poems to drum up interest in the fight. "I done wrestled with an alligator. I done tussled with a whale. Only last week I murdered a rock, injured a stone, hospitalised a brick. I'm so mean I make medicine sick." Due to a 6-week delay after Foreman's eyebrow was cut open in training, Ali had a lot of time to talk before the fight, and he spent most of it saying how much he'd dance around Foreman. Foreman clearly registered this and was training a technique called cutting off the ring, where he'd corner Ali and back him up against the ropes, where he could unleash a barrage of abuse on Ali's body. Just before the fight, Ali's dressing room was dead quiet. No one in his entourage, like most of the other followers of boxing, gave him any chance. But Ali took it upon himself to get them up. He wasn't going to sit there and let them mope before the biggest fight of his life, and so he danced around the room shouting at them, "I'm going to dance! What am I going to do? I'm going to dance!" It worked, and they all got up and about, allegedly all choking back tears as they did so. It's super interesting contrasting the commentary of the fighters as each of them walked out to face each other. For Ali, it's relatively forlorn, with the commentator saying, "If Ali is to retire, this will be a historic vision," suggesting he himself didn't have much hope for the former champ. Foreman, however, got a much more positively toned response. And here comes the world champion. For the record, Ali didn't retire after the fight. Stunningly, he fought 22 more times. As the fight began, it was clear that both fighters had underestimated each other. Ali was able to land blows on Foreman with a technique called a right hand lead, essentially loading up with his hand that's further away, giving Foreman more time to evade. None of Foreman's training partners would have insulted him with such a technique, but Ali's speed was such that he could get through Foreman's defense. Ali had underestimated Foreman's ability to cut off the ring and found himself out of position and backing up towards the ropes. Foreman's ability to corner Ali against the ropes is what ended up characterizing the fight. As Ali struggled to defend Foreman's huge blows, holding on to Foreman wherever possible in what was dubbed the rope-a-dope. Interestingly though, Ali didn't just immediately go to the ropes. He initially tried to get off the ropes, but found that Foreman's footwork and positioning were too strong. The rope-a-dope lasted a punishing 5 rounds. Such was the one-sided nature of the fight up to that point, it prompted boxing journalist George Plimpton to say, "The fix is in," speculating whether Ali's intention was to take a dive and go down without really being defeated. As Foreman pummeled away at him though, Ali was all the while speaking to Foreman, whispering in his ear whenever he could. "Is that all you got, George?" According to Foreman, when he heard Ali say those words after the 6th round and he'd spent all that time up against the ropes, he knew he'd wasted all those punches. Ali had made him angry and emotional, and he chose to spend his energy pummeling Ali's body instead of his head where he could have scored a knockout. It seemed this was Ali's plan all along. Foreman's previously longest fight was just 8 rounds, and Ali knew that if he could aggravate him enough to spend all of his energy, there would come a time when he had nothing left to give, and so it was. Ali started to get back on top of Foreman, and in the 8th round delivered one of the most aesthetic knockouts of all time, with Ali choosing to hold his final punch to prolong the image of the tall timber slowly stumbling to the ground. The loss sent Foreman into 2 years of deep depression that nearly took his life. I might do a podcast on Foreman later down the line somewhere, because he's an admirable character, the way that he was able to bounce back from the loss to Ali. For Ali though, he went on to have a series of title defences, including one against Chuck the Bleeder Wepner, a grueling 15-round affair, which was only stopped because Wepner was bleeding too profusely. Wepner's admirable defeat later became a big inspiration for Sylvester Stallone's Rocky character. It was a good time for Ali, who had started acting and was establishing himself well and truly as the greatest of all time. But coming back up through the ranks was his nemesis, Smoking Joe Frazier, who now wanted to knock Ali off his perch, in the same way Ali had for him years earlier. It set up what is now seen as arguably the best fight of all time, the Thriller in Manila. Although they'd already fought 2 bruising encounters, this is seen as the best fight of the 3 fights between Ali and Frazier, which also included the fight of the century. As an interesting aside, I think you could argue that Ali had the fight of the century 3 times in 3 years, with the fight with Foreman added to the trilogy. After their 2 previous encounters, there was no love lost between the 2 men, with Ali turning up at a press conference with a gorilla doll, which he said represented Frazier. Ali goaded Frazier condescendingly in the media, including when he said, "It'll be a killer, a chiller, a thriller when I get the gorilla in Manila." Frazier still hated Ali for the way that he was treated. He said of Ali, "I still despised him for trying to misrepresent me to the public. No one gave his heart and soul to the sport as I did. This was a nasty, envious, mean-spirited egomaniac who still couldn't stand the fact that in the biggest fight of his life, I put him on his ass." When the bell finally rang to start the fight, Frazier looked Ali dead in the eye and said, "I'm going to kill you, Clay. You're dead." From the start of the fight, it was all offense from both fighters. Ali knew Frazier was a slow starter, but Frazier seemed impervious to Ali's shots, with Frazier seemingly bouncing off his fist and pinning Ali back against the ropes. Frazier later said of the fight, "There was no dope he was going to rope. This time, sit on the ropes, he was going to pay. I hit the chump whenever and wherever. Arms, ribs, whatever was exposed, I beat on." By the 4th round, Both fighters had been visibly shaken by huge blows from the other. Ironically, for the fact that these two had some of the best defences of all time in boxing, neither of them was overly concerned about defending themselves, and they were both going hell for leather. Speaking of the intensity of the confrontation, Frazier said, "To take on Clay, you have to crowd him and accelerate the tempo, not letting him work at the pace he wants. Hurry him and he'll begin to huff and puff. It became a battle of survival. Now that's my kind of fight." From rounds 5 to 7, Ali was caught on the ropes, but this time there was no rope-a-dope. He was trying to fight cross-guard, a more defensive style that the legendary Archie Moore had tried to teach him years earlier, so he didn't have to rely so much on his speed and mobility. Ali replied that he wouldn't need it, as he planned to retire young. By the end of the 7th, Angelo Dundee berated Ali for wasting the previous rounds. "You wasted those rounds. You don't go to the ropes against Joe Frazier." Ali knew he was right, and that he had to get back on top somehow. He was able to do this though, in the 8th. Although he was unable to dance or clinch due to the battering he'd already received, he was trading heavy blows and going toe-to-toe with Frazier. Like the first fight, Ali was getting 3 shots to Frazier's 1, except this time not light shots, he was hitting Frazier with everything he had. By midway through the round, he was punched out. Ali later recalled he was at the end of exhaustion and struggling to stay awake between rounds. He felt he was close to death. At this point, there was still 7 rounds to go. The next rounds were spent largely trying to regain energy for the fighters. Neither scored a knockdown, but both had landed many brutal blows. In the 12th round, Frazier's eyes started swelling. Frazier's style was like a marathon runner. It was like he had a steady pace for miles, but he gradually weakened throughout the fight. Ali, however, was more like a sprinter, taking long breaks and then releasing all that he'd saved up in short bursts. Ali was under constant pressure, but he could pick his spots more and inflict accurate blows at targeted spots in Frazier's face. Frazier could hardly see, so he had to stand further back from Ali. Ali later said at this point in the fight, "I opened his lip and closed his eyes, but he still kept coming, forcing me onto the ropes, making me deliver power when I didn't even know if it was still there." At the end of the 13th round, Frazier's coach, the legendary Eddie Futch, gave him one more round. He could see how much damage his fighter had taken, but Frazier was still landing punches on Ali, and Futch knew that Ali couldn't take much more himself. He was right. Ali had passed his known limits in the 13th round, but gave everything he had in the 14th. 3 brutal fights, 41 grueling rounds, 2 world championships, and 5 years of despising each other more than anyone else in the world had led to this, and neither of them had anything left but the will to go on. At one point, Frazier threw a punch with so much of his available energy that his whole body seemed to follow the momentum of his fist, and he crashed into Ali. Both fighters were spent and wandered clumsily around the ring. After the round, the referee had to guide Frazier back to his corner, as he physically couldn't see. Ali himself didn't know how long he had left. He felt close to death. But Eddie Futch stopped the fight, despite Frazier's protests. "No, don't. I want him, boss," the vanquished champion groaned. But Futch responded, "It's all over, son. No one will ever forget what you did today." When Ali realised that he'd won, he collapsed. There was no celebration, no apparent joy. He had taken over 440 punches from one of the hardest hitters in the history of the world. It's been said of the Thriller in Manila that both men left a piece of themselves in the ring, each a piece they'd never get back. Speculation followed Ali about the cognitive decline he suffered as a result of the damage in that fight. Ali himself seemed to acknowledge this when he said, "We left to Manila as champions. We came back as old men." To me, this is where the story gets a bit sad, because Ali fought on for 6 more years. After his victory, he said about the business of defending his title. His speech and movement were starting to slow, and the people around him started to get worried. But Ali was a man of conviction, and no one was going to tell him no. They would have known he'd fight on, So they didn't want to leave him in the hands of people who didn't care for him as much as they did and were only there to make money out of him. In his later fights, Ali fought Ken Norton for a third time, winning on points by a bare margin. He lost to Leon Spinks, and Ali's doctor resigned, recognising that they couldn't conscionably support him continuing to get back into the ring. After defeating Spinks in the rematch, Ali became the first man to win the World Championship 3 times. He'd held the title on and off for over 14 and a half years. 9 months later, he retired. It was to be short-lived, however, as he returned to fight Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick, both fights that he lost. When he defeated Ali, it said that Larry Holmes ended up in Ali's suite at Caesar's Palace, crying at the feet of his fallen hero. This time, Ali's retirement was for good. In 1984, Ali was hospitalised for symptoms of Parkinson's disease, less than 3 years after his last fight. In 1986, he started what he said was his true calling as a humanitarian, statesman, and promoter of tolerance and peace worldwide. Despite his condition, Ali spent 200 days a year travelling the world, visiting hospitals, orphanages, mosques, and homes for the disenfranchised. In 1996, at the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Ali was bestowed the honour of lighting the flame. To be indulgent for a moment, this is actually one of my earliest memories. I was 3 in 1996, but I remember seeing what could have been a replay of Ali lighting the flame, and I remember knowing that there was something special about him. I didn't know what it was, but I just remember looking up at the TV and knowing there was something magical about this figure. At the Games in Atlanta, Ali was awarded a commemorative gold medal to replace the one he'd thrown in the Ohio River. Upon being presented with the medal, Ali lifted it to his lips and kissed it. To me, this is one of the most symbolic moments of Muhammad Ali's entire life. He'd thrown away the medal due to what it symbolised, and now he was able to lift it to his lips and kiss it with pride. And without trivialising some of the social issues still to be solved in America, to be able to see America as something more positive, I think, is something that Ali earned. When so many people these days complain about their lot in life or their treatment by the government, he went out and changed his country for the better at the cost of great personal sacrifice. In 2005, Ali was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's the highest honour that can be bestowed upon a civilian in America. Muhammad Ali died on the 3rd of June 2016 at the age of 74. It made worldwide news, with many people, including international sports stars and celebrities, sharing their adoration for the champion fighter. In summing up for today's podcast, there's a few points that I want to make about Ali, to tie it all in with the themes of this podcast. Firstly, it's just to reiterate what I said at the start about him being an icon of self-determinism. Obviously, his response to being drafted and his readiness to face the consequences contributed to that. But it's also his response to those who disrespected him by not calling him his name. He's not someone who demanded respect, he commanded respect. The degree to which he stood for his convictions is absolutely incredible, given what he faced on so many levels. To face up to it all unapologetically and prepared to face whatever costs came his way is something that we just don't see in leadership anymore. In terms of his personality, there was so much more to Ali than just his brash persona. He employed his persona to serve the deeper elements of his personality, and he recognised that at times, that meant being an agitator and saying things that on face value were more aggressive than the outcome he intended to achieve. He said at different times that he hated white people and he didn't hate white people. But what didn't change was his conviction that everyone should be able to determine their own future. He spoke all throughout his life about doing God's work, initially to a Christian God and then a Muslim one. He always had that sense that he was connected to something larger. It's a pretty trivial and comical example, but even before he boarded the plane to Zaire for the Rumble in the Jungle, as he gave his final interview before the biggest fight of his life, he took the opportunity to educate children about brushing their teeth. Looking dead into the camera and delivering it with as much enthusiasm as he would if he was talking about his next prize fight, he said, "We must whip Mr. Tooth Decay." It's as if he always used his platform to be edifying or to contribute towards some cause in a particular way. In terms of his boxing, it really is hard to think of another fighter who could be considered the greatest. Despite arguably having the greatest career of any boxer in history, his best years were taken from him, and arguably we never got to see his prime as a boxer. In terms of the narrative of his career, it's hard to envisage any athlete ever being the underdog so much. These days, we'd eventually just expect them to win. But with Liston and Foreman, no one gave him a chance at all. And he faced Frazier after Frazier had proved that he was the superior boxer toe-to-toe. Without his enforced layoff, he could have just spent the whole time improving as a boxer, and he may have just beaten everyone. Had he not had his enforced layoff, I honestly think he could have just gone full Roger Federer and dominated the sport for years. The other thing that strikes me is his longevity. He fought Sonny Liston, who was the world champion in 1962. He then took the title off George Foreman in 1974, who himself regained the world championship in 1994. So within the list of names that he beat were world champions Foreman and Liston, who held the title more than 35 years apart from each other. Granted, that's partly due to Foreman achieving this so late in life, but I think it's a telling statistic all the same. As I said earlier, you could argue that he had the fight of the century 3 times in 3 years with Frazier, Foreman, Frazier. Plus, he beat opponents from just about every conceivable style of boxing, often adapting himself to appear as a completely different fighter stylistically from other times throughout his career. His career had quantity, it had quality, and it had diversity. It had it all. The way he introduced trash talking into boxing changed the sport forever. He changed the perception about what a champion should be. He's also the perfect example of why I think sport is always played between the ears. He was a tactical champion and a master of psychological warfare. When pushed on this and asked how he psyched his opponents out, Ali said, "You don't really psych them out, you really make them fight harder. It doesn't put fear in them, and that's the thing. It makes them fight too hard. It makes them anxious." But for me, the real last impressions I get of Ali aren't even as a boxer. As I said at the start, I think heavyweight boxing is about the biggest themes in life. It's about life or death and purpose. According to Ali himself, there comes a time in the ring where you wonder what you're doing there. It seems to me that without a solid connection to a deeper purpose, you'd quit long before many of these boxers do. Plus, boxers traditionally come from backgrounds where they would have spent a lot of time in fight or flight mode. Their paradigm would have included violence anyway, and boxing is a way to channel that and refine their philosophy. Ali said of both Patterson and Terrell, who refused to refer to him by his name, they go down in history as just athletes. To Ali, boxing wasn't just about athletic prowess, it was about building a platform. Speaking before the Rumble in the Jungle, he said, "I'm going to fight for the prestige, not for me, but to uplift my little brothers who are sleeping on concrete floors today in America. Black people who are living on welfare, black people who can't eat, black people who don't know no knowledge of themselves, black people who don't have no future." Then, speaking with Parkinson in 1971, he compared boxing to cockfighting. Ali clearly loved the sport, but at some point, it became about more than that. After his career, Ali reflected on how his perspective had changed throughout his life. He said, "Let me tell you, when I was a kid, I got mad enough to want to kill somebody. But as you travel the world, and I'm struggling with a freedom fight against nations, you can't get enough hate in you to be mad at one man just because it's a boxing match. Even Floyd Patterson, who condemned my Islamic religion and didn't want to call me Muhammad Ali and said I should have gone to the army and I should be in jail. As bad as he was, I wasn't really mad at him because he was brainwashed by the establishment." But Ali didn't just perpetuate negativity. He felt that he was treated unjustly, but to him, he wanted to focus on how he could help people. I mentioned earlier about how he gave a graduating address at Harvard. At the end of that address, the crowd shouted to him to give them a poem. Although he'd spent most of his career concocting complex poems about his opponents, on this occasion, he opted for a much shorter creation. He simply paused for a moment and said 2 words, "Me, we." To me, although he was a divisive figure during his life, Ali is someone who fought to bring people together. He fought against injustice and gave representation to the black community when there were people actively trying to suppress it. In 1981, in his third appearance on Parkinson, he's pushed on his health and whether he should continue fighting. His speech already much slower and cognitive tests at the time confirming his decline, he gave an insight into his thinking that I think illustrates who Muhammad Ali really was. Some people can see further than others, so therefore, when people judge what I'm doing with their logic, it can't be done. Their reasoning, their knowledge, and their logic clashes with my superior belief. It's an attitude that got him so far in his career and life, but ultimately, it meant he didn't defer to the medical community when they were telling him to stop fighting. Although there is a part of me that's sad about this, if there's one thing I've got from Muhammad Ali, it's that I don't think he's sad about this. According to his friends and family, he never wanted sympathy or showed self-pity. When thinking about Muhammad Ali, I'm reminded of a story from the Iliad, which was immortalized in Greek mythology for thousands of years. In the poem, the Iliad, Achilles is famously given the choice between a long and peaceful life or a short life that will bring him everlasting glory. Achilles explains to Odysseus in Book 9 of the Iliad, "My mother Thetis tells me that there are two ways in which I may meet my end. If I stay here and fight, I shall not return alive, but my name will live forever. Whereas, if I go home, my name will die, but it will be long, ere death shall take me." To me, it's not as if Ali was given one such decision in life, but the series of decisions he made ensured that he sacrificed his health and potentially longevity for greatness. Ali said early in his career that he planned to retire young, but at some point he decided he wanted to keep fighting on. Now, I do want to point out too, he died when he was 74 and achieved more with Parkinson's than so many of us will in our lifetime. But that's why, to me, his condition in later life wasn't such a tragedy. Ali knew what he was getting himself into, and like everything else he did, he readily faced the consequences. Like Achilles, to me, this is one of the things that ensures Ali's greatness will still be remembered long after he's gone. If anything, you could argue he got the best of both worlds. Although he still fought Parkinson's disease, it meant that he didn't have to fight any people anymore, physically or politically. And he was able to live out the rest of his days in relative peace. So that's why, to me, even though his body let him down, Muhammad Ali was able to really get the most out of a life. To finish up, I want to leave you with Ali's own words that, in my opinion, represent who Ali was and what he did better than anyone else could represent him. After defeating Liston to receive his first world championship at just 22 years of age, in his post-fight interview, where Ali appears about as excited as any human is capable of, he finishes the interview with the words, "I shook up the world. I shook up the world." So that's all we've got time for today. I'm going to put up a whole bunch of resources about Ali, including some great YouTube videos from David Christian's channel, The Modern Martial Artist. His fight analysis is some of the best I've seen. So head along to www.individuate.com.au and click on the episode page for today. I've got a fair list of resources for today's episode, so you can find them all there if you want to take a deeper dive. We'll look to unpack some more of Ali's story in future episodes, because if there's anyone who was able to get the best out of themselves in the service of others, he'd be one of the first few who comes to mind. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I hope to do it again on the next episode of Individuate.